How many of you were here yesterday? Okay. There's going to be some overlap between today and yesterday, but the focus of our discussion is going to be a little bit different. And the purpose of this session is to talk about the four main strategies that schools can use if they're interested in improving outcomes for students with disabilities. At the end, I'm going to show you some data. We began this process in Florida. We started implementing MTSS in Florida statewide in 2003, 2004. And everything we do is organized around that framework. Our special education eligibility for SLD, EBD, and language impairment is purely based upon response to instruction. We got very, very serious about changing our structures because our students with disabilities were at about the national average in terms of proficiency, but they weren't improving. And so we took this concerted effort and put these four strategies in place. In 2017, with the NAEP data, Florida was the only state in which students with disabilities actually closed the gap significantly with general education kids. I have some data to show you at the end. The data are only a couple of weeks old to reinforce the effectiveness of these strategies. So we only have 70 minutes together today. That frustrates me. I'm sure it frustrates you. But I'm going to try to go over the essence of these things and then have you do some self-evaluation in your district, in your school. But I really want you to, this is a thinking session. In 60 minutes or what have you, there's no way we're going to get into skills, and I'll talk about that in a second. This is a good opportunity for you to share, think, and talk about these four strategies. I know for many of us, we may not be at the pay grade to go and implement this stuff overnight. However, for most of you, how many of you are teachers one way or the other? General ed, special ed? Okay, any principals in here? Yes, awesome. Principals can certainly, and having been one, I learned very quickly in my principalship phase of my life that as long as I did what the district wanted me to do on my annual performance evaluation and not screw that up, I could then get creative and start doing things as long as they didn't put the superintendent in jail. That was kind of the cutting point. And we started doing a lot of this stuff then at a school level. We really don't want to do that now. We want to do it at a district level. But last night we were talking about some things with Jolly and her leadership team about things that schools can do and then highlight for other schools in perhaps a summer share and learn conference and this kind of stuff. So we certainly can do stuff at a school level. However, if you're a parent of a student in a school district, you really don't want to have some of your schools doing really innovative things and other schools not. It's not fair. Every school, you're supposed to be able to send your kid to any school in a district and get the same education, right? So in any event, but I want you to think and talk about this. I said this yesterday. I said with every session I do, there are four major goals to professional learning. Learning forward standards, knowledge, skills, dispositions, and practices. The purpose of this session is knowledge and dispositions, beliefs, and knowing about things to then be able to explore them further. I'm giving you some websites and stuff today that you can go to. Basically, the goals for today is let's identify what these four things are, and let's talk about them, and talk about what they look like when they're implemented well. Okay? And please ask questions. I'm we are recording this session, and so if you're asking a question or answer, if you ask a question, I'm going to repeat it. But if you're going to talk, particularly if you're back here, would you speak up so that the microphone will pick up on the camera? So we're basically going to talk about these four things. I'd like for you to have some courageous conversations about these practices in your building. So think about it. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And that's what we're trying to do here. I don't think we can do anything more for the individual students with disabilities that we work with until and unless the system starts creating other opportunities for these kids to allow the work that you do to become real in Tier 1 for them. So think about that. True, false. I'm going to give you some true, false questions quickly. And I want you to say true or false, kind of look at the people next to you and just compare kind of quietly. We're not going to stop and take time to do this. A strong relationship exists between the level of inclusion and the rate of growth and proficiency for students with disabilities. True or false? Just say true or false, look at each other. It's like, So I also want you to think about this. I'm making this complicated, but you all are smart. You know how to do this. I want you to think about if it's true or false, and I'll tell you based upon my perceptions and research whether it is or not. But we also have to think about beliefs here. Do people believe that? And do they believe it enough to do it? I know that our general education colleagues have got to have more support in order to make inclusion work without scaring the crap out of them. Okay? And we have a lot of work to do around that. So there are different beliefs. It's interesting that every time there's a movement in the United States to take students with disabilities out of the accountability system, and that movement is bubbling up again, particularly by school boards and superintendents groups, because most of the TSI schools, the targeted schools for improvement, are there because of the performance of kids with disabilities. And the easiest way to get off the TSI list is to stop including kids with disabilities in the accountability system, right? Advocacy groups and parents do not want that. As much as they advocate for all the stuff around special ed, they know the minute we take accountability away and lower the standards, that their children are in deep trouble. So there's a yin and yang of this. And all of this is operating when we say, let's increase inclusion. But the answer to this is yes. There is a strong relationship between percent of time, and when you hit the 80% or more, that is really the benchmark that accelerates kids with disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So I'm going to give you some time to turn and talk on this one. The second one, a common scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction between Tier 1, specially designed, and other supports is necessary in order to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. What do you think about that? And kind of look around, and also, is it true or false in your view? And then what about beliefs? Do people believe it? I'll move out of your way. Also, if you go on the website, whether you do it now or later, all of this stuff is, all you have to do is download it. Now, don't you start, because if you start, I'm going to start. No, I'm only teasing. I didn't hear anybody coughing yesterday. So I don't know whether, I think I'm going to find out if we were all in the bar last night and close to each other. We may have spread all of this in that bar area. Yeah, exactly. So what do you think? Yes. So what are the implications? We'll talk, we're going to do turn and talk on all these. The implication for this is that as special ed teachers, in the work that we're doing around the IEP goals, is that we have to be sure to keep aligned with what's happening in Tier 1 if we're going to have our kids 80% or more in Tier 1. Is that making sense? Okay, and then we're going to talk about a process to do that. A strong relationship exists between a fully compliant IEP and the rate of growth for students with disabilities. I think facilitators and administrators of special ed believe that. But the answer is no. And the answer is no because IEPs, if they're fully compliant, we're going to look at some stuff, they don't have instructional strategies in there. They have goals. There's nothing in there about instruction. Instruction is what moves kids. So, if I were a special ed teacher now, working with kids, I would, in my own work, have an addendum to the IEP. And on that addendum, it would have each of the goals and my evidence-based instructional strategies and what I know about how Tier 1 is teaching that. Does that make sense? Because if Tier 1 is teaching it in a way that is not working for your kids, then you have to think about what am I going to do to mitigate that, and how can I influence choices that are made in Tier 1. It's really important. I mentioned yesterday that I'm doing a thing for the state of Arkansas, and I'm doing it personally for the first 2 years with 2 cohorts. It's called the Novice Special Education Teacher Program, and it's a program for special education teachers with 3 or fewer years of experience. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to make grammatical errors today because my brain is someplace else. And it's a special ed teacher, the principal, and a general ed teacher from their school. We have 5 days on site, Zoom sessions in between, and lots of homework and kinds of things that they do in between. One of the first things I asked them to do in the first 3 weeks of school, the first 2 days were last summer. The next 2 days are going to be at the end of June for the new cohort. I asked them to sit in on a lesson planning meeting and go in and observe at least 2 of their kids getting instruction in Tier 1. And then they had a response sheet, and we talked about that, etc. Without exception, the response to the second question was, when I watched how the teacher in Tier 1 was teaching, what they were expecting my students to do in response to that teaching, performance things, whether it's writing, verbal, participation, they said, we realized that we were not preparing our kids for the time that we had with them, for the demands in that classroom, because we never went in. We only went in there because you're requiring that we do it, so we get our little fancy certificate to put on the wall, right? And they were shocked. They just did it. It's not speaking badly of them. That requires time. They had to alter their schedule. They had to get other people to help you. You know what it's like if you take 20 or 30 minutes off. And they wanted to do it during ELA or English and math sessions, which is typically in the morning when everybody's kind of on lockdown and what have you. So it required some change of schedule and all of that type of stuff, but they were shocked at what they saw. And it really disturbed them. And they came back and like, what do we do about this? How do we fix it? So we talked about that. IEPs that are standards aligned for the grade in which a student is enrolled, not deficit focused only, do not contribute to improved proficiency for students with disabilities. True or false? In the interest of time, the answer is false because they do contribute to it. If they are standards aligned, it's a mindset. So if you're a 5th grade teacher and you have a student with a disability who is reading fluently at the 2nd grade level, and you have a standards aligned IEP, and if for ELA, that's going to be comprehension. And you know what the 5th and 6th grade comprehension standards are that Indiana uses and all the other states. What we do know is if they are standards in line for the grade in which the kid is enrolled, it forces us to think about what the real goal for that kid, even though the emergency goal is how do we get this kid to read? And so it does. It broadens people's thinking about instruction. So food for thought. I don't know, how many of you have electronic IEPs? We just only use electronic IEPs. Is it true or false? When you're doing an IEP for a 5th grade student, can you only put in 5th grade standards? No. Yeah, some of you are saying yes. Some are saying yes, some are saying no. So that's part of the issue. In my state, you can't. You can bang that drop-down menu as much as you want, and it knows from the student ID what grade level the kid is in. You're only going to get grade level standards, only. So the answer is yes. Integrated lesson planning between general and special ed results in improved outcomes for students with disabilities. How many of you co-plan with grade level PLCs or subject area PLCs? Okay, only a few. This is a big component for accelerating the performance of kids with disabilities. We'll talk about it. Instructional strategies exist for use in Tier 1 by general education teachers that are evidence-based for both kids with and without disabilities. And for kids with disabilities, those instructional strategies grow those kids faster if it's done in Tier 1 than in small group instruction. What do you think about that? The answer is yes. The next one, a strong predictor of rates of growth for students with disabilities, is the performance of all kids in Tier 1. So I'm going to say it straight out. You cannot move your kids with disabilities to a higher level. Now, so we have a yin-yang here. We know that inclusion at 80% or more really accelerates kids. But what if that inclusion is in a Tier 1 setting with ineffective instruction for all kids? That's the problem. So you can't move kids with disabilities beyond the level of the performance of kids in Tier 1 who are struggling learners. So if you have your data that you can look at for your school data, take a look at the performance of kids who are on free and reduced lunch. Take a look at the performance of kids who are EL. And take a look at the performance of racial and ethnic diversity, but only if it overlaps with poverty. So you may have, I work with schools where 85% of the kids in the school are lily white, middle class kids. And the school performance looks really good until you pull out the 20% that aren't. Kids with disabilities, poverty primarily, and English learners. And those kids are not doing well. But their proportion of them is small enough to allow the school to look good. So if your kid is an EL or your kid is in poverty, your kid with disability, that you don't reap the benefits of that high level of school performance. So we don't want to, we have to fix Tier 1 first. It does exist. I went through this yesterday. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the stuff. Those are Indiana data that show, regardless over time of the tests that you use and all this kind of stuff, that the gaps between general ed and special ed have not narrowed at all. In fact, they've gotten bigger. So it doesn't look good. And these are some data that I did just for the biggest speech. So, well, we switched the test. Even when you switched the test a few years ago and everybody's scores dropped, the gap between general and special ed remained the same. And in the last few years, that gap has not closed. So whatever is happening, the benefits are not occurring for kids with disabilities. But don't feel badly about Indiana. You're in the same place as a lot of other people. And these are the gaps you can see. The gaps have not changed. I have 4 graphs here, and I want you to look at them very quickly because some of you were here yesterday, and I don't want to spend too much time duplicating. And the point is, these are data that demonstrate the relationship between growth over 3 years of time at grade 4 and grade 7 for 2 different school districts, one that was growing Tier 1 performance and one that was not. So if you look at the slope of the line here, you will see that over 3 years, this 4th grade district 4th graders grew. And you can see the performance of kids with disabilities grew at about the same rate of growth if you did a regression or an average line for that. This is at the 7th grade. The growth was slower. Which higher grades you get, the rate of growth tends to diminish for everybody. But also, kids with disabilities grew. Now look at another district in the same state with some decrease over time, and look at the parallel kids with disabilities. And then finally, a 7th grade going down the tubes. And by the way, and this is just an aside, if a decline is happening in earlier grades, by the time you get to the later grades, that decline is going to be a lot worse. Because now kids are coming to the upper grades, entering at a lower level of performance. Same thing happens for our kids with disabilities. If in our state, I work with a lot of districts and state departments of education across the United States, and I make these recommendations to them. Put 70% of your resources in elementary into K or pre-K through 3. Put 70% of your resources in grade 6 in middle school and 70% of your resources in grade 9. Those transition years are extremely difficult, and you need all the supports in that first year of transition. Many states are creating the concept of ninth grade academies, in which ninth grade is treated very differently. Because if you go into credit recovery in ninth grade, it's a problem. And it carries with you. So when you think about where you want your emphasis to be on ensuring that our kids with disabilities come out of third grade as strong as possible, it's in the first 4 years, pre-K or K through 3. I was having a conversation last night with someone, and we were talking about the fact that the middle of first grade, around this time of year for first grade, is a crisis moment. Kids with disabilities or not, any kid in trouble at the middle of first grade has got to have all hands on deck if you don't want to have a problem with that kid not being able to read when they leave third grade. We cannot wait. I'm not saying forget, kindergarten is hugely important, but it's a little wonky. Kids tend to be all over the place. We don't want to create a crisis in kindergarten. But by the middle of first grade, if those kids are not getting the basic concepts and mechanics of reading, we can't wait any longer. We have to create a cohort that everything we have in a building comes down on those kids. Being a building principal, I could not fathom that we would have a kid in our building for 4 years, and at the end of third grade, that kid could not read. That was totally and completely unacceptable. And fixing it after third grade is a nightmare. Let's face it. We're all saying, good, we have all these programs and all that kind of people try very hard. But by the end of third grade, you now have completed 25% of your total education. And if you're that far behind, you're not going to catch up. We try our best, but seldom does it happen. So think about that in this process as well. So the implications for policy and practice: improve effectiveness of instruction and supports for all kids in Tier 1 first. Your school-based leadership team should be absolutely focused on the data for kindergarten, first, second, and third, and meeting on a regular basis. If you've got formative assessments every 4 weeks, those become reviewable. Have your kids with disabilities participating in those assessments. Kids with disabilities are going to do better on formative assessments for grade level early on because the gap is not as big. Those assessments will show for kids. That school leadership team should be focused on K through 3 monthly, 6th grade monthly. You guys do it? How many of you work in middle schools? You have 4.5-week grade reports. You put kids on notice, parent, blah, blah. You have data every 4.5 weeks. Don't just do it. Just don't do the data. Sit down and say, what the heck is going on? Those of you who teach middle school, you know if a kid is bombed the first 5 weeks, the 4 weeks will not enable them to recover to some kind of a passable grade. Just do that. You have, what, 5/9, 55%, if my math is correct, of what determines a kid's grade already in the bucket, and it's down here. The remaining 45% you can't do well enough to bring it up if you're really low. Time is critical here. So if you put a lot of these efforts into K through 3, 6, and 9, you will have more bang for your buck in helping students with disabilities as well as other kids. Equity and access to grade level content is critical. And we talked about this other stuff. So the 4 strategies that we're going to go through here for the next almost hour is looking at how do we increase the level of inclusion and make it not a place where a kid is sitting and is not included. Inclusion does not refer to the student. It refers to the environment including the student. And that switch in thought is critical. You can include, so in a building, if you've got kids scattered, included in different classrooms, and some of them are doing well and some of them aren't, The question is not about the kid. You put all the kids in there. The question is, for some kids, that environment included them. For others, it did not. So inclusion should be on us. How do we include diverse learners? It should not be a verb or something that is measured by how many kids spend what percent of their time, although for federal reporting and your state performance indicators, you have to do that. But that is not the metric that will tell us if kids are going to get better as a result of it. The metric is how the pedagogy in the classroom includes diversity. So please think about that. Integrated lesson planning will help ensure all IEPs are standards aligned and specially designed instruction, which is your bailiwick. Ensure that it's standards aligned. So if we have a 5th grade kid in ELA and this kid is not able to read sufficiently to access the content, that's a problem. That can be fixed. How many of you work with kids every day that they clearly use age-appropriate words and concepts and know what they mean, but they could never read it? So the 5th grade standard's comprehension. We have to ensure that our specially designed instruction is focusing on comprehension. We have to solve the access issue. Text-to-speech is one way to do it. You know that kind of stuff. Fluency is only an emergency when it's a barrier to accessing grade level content. We need to still work on fluency, but let's be honest, how many IEPs have a fluency goal? Remember, 97% of all kids with learning disabilities are in for ELA. Only about 3% are in for math. So regardless, and let's be honest, for how many years do these kids have fluency goals and never get to grade level? So what we're saying is, if that's not going to happen, and that's pretty much what happens, that is the pony you have to ride to the dance. If you can't read, and that's the primary method of acquiring content, then you're a mess. You're never going to be able. So on an IEP that is a 5th grade comprehension standard, our specially designed instruction should have in there how we're going to break the barrier for access to content. So we're going to use text-to-speech or whatever we're going to use to ensure that the kid has access to the content. You then also could have another goal that is focused on how to get the kid independently able to be more fluent. But I look at IEP goals every year. I'm looking at some right now in a district in California around the same issue. And every year, I have the last 3 years for a sample of kids. Every year, the goal for fluency is somebody made up. Remember, your goal for next year is based upon the average rate of growth for the last 3 years. So I see in there, well, increase fluency to the such and such grade level. The kid hasn't done that in 3 or 4 years. What makes you think it's going to happen now? What the kid really needs is, now that fluency is reading to learn, this kid needs access to content, and we need to be focused on comprehension. So the first thing is, how are we going to get rid of the fluency barrier to reading? And then the second thing is, sure, do some stuff around fluency, but don't deny kid access to content because the kid can't read at grade level. That may be never going to happen. And universal education driven by universal design for learning. Universal education means that our instructional strategies in Tier 1 are evidence-based for diverse learners. And this idea of teaching the way we've always taught and then expecting title, special ed, EL, or whatever else we have going on to fix it. It's not working. So these 4 things, let's talk about them. But before we talk about them, I want you to, at your table, here's your instructions. This will be a 3-step instruction. So however you give directions to kids, You know, look, listen, say, do. Look at me. Put your hand when you're ready to listen. I don't mean that. This is going to be a 3-step direction, so use your fingers to be sure you got all 3 steps to it. Blah, 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 blah. Okay? I want you to first read each of these. By yourself, I want you to put down a rating for how well you think your school or district is implementing this. So a 5 is full implementation, 4 is you're implementing, 3 is you're getting ready to implement, 2 is you're having courageous conversations around wanting to implement, and 1, you're just not addressing it. Got the rating? So first, read it. I'll read them to you. Would that help? First, read it. Second, privately do a rating. Third, share with your table. You got it? Anybody want to give me the 3 steps back? First, read it. Second, private rate. Third, public rate. And share and see where you are at your table. So these are the 4 things I just talked about. Increase inclusion significantly with inclusive instruction. IEPs and specially designed instruction are standards aligned for grade level in which the kid is enrolled. Integrated lesson planning, general ed, title, special ed, lesson plan together. And 4, universal instruction, as teachers in Tier 1 are developing instructional strategies to attain learning goals that are aligned with standards. Are they thinking about instructional strategies for the diverse learners in their classroom? What that might look like is a planning team takes a standard developed learning goal, they then develop instructional strategies, and before they do anything else, they stop and say, for whom will these instructional approaches and student performance demands not work? And then circle back. Now, if you're a special ed teacher at that table, this is a time for you to be able to think about how do we alter, are there other instructional strategies that will benefit everybody, including kids with disabilities? That's what that universal instruction is for. So rate those 4. How much inclusion with inclusive instruction, IEPs and SDI are standards aligned, integrated lesson planning, and this idea of universal instruction in Tier 1 and not general education. 5 is best, 1 is not the best, private, public. Thank you. For the first one, and I did 1 to 5, so you can use 1 hand. You don't have to put up 2 hands. So just put up your private rating on increase inclusion significantly with inclusive instruction. 4, awesome. 3, 4, 4. I see some 2s, 2s. So it's a wide range. That's fair. IEPs and SDIs are standards aligned, including the instruction for the grade level in which the kid is enrolled. So standards aligned 5. If I said just the instruction, would you change your score? People are saying yes. So standards aligned is you're compliant. Now how do you convert that to instruction? We probably need more supports around that, typically. Integrated lesson planning, co-planning with 1s, 0s. Okay, so I don't know what to say.
Neither do I.
I'm always a hugely positive person. I'm never negative. But this is critical. Everything else you do is not going to help as much as if you do this. We do it. We're doing a session maybe the next session on what that looks like. If you don't come to this session, to the next session, that's fine. But on the downloads, you'll have a PowerPoint plus all of the templates for doing it, and along with narrative guide. So just download that stuff and read it on your own and see what you think. It's critical, absolutely critical. And then universal instruction in Tier 1. 1, 1, 1, 2, 4. Awesome. That you're doing it. Your ratings are exactly the same as people in other states that I work with. So general ed partners have to work smarter, not harder, to ensure that there's an inclusive environment. how we work together can help that. But because Tier 1 is the best predictor of the outcome for students with disabilities, Tier 1 is a critical player in this. That involves district and school leadership, right? So even if it's above your pay grade, I want you to know what these things are. I also had, very quickly, I had somebody ask me a question, 5th grade, and students reading at the 2nd grade level fluently, and there's still an expectation that they have to read in order to do this, and cold reads, that kind of stuff. I understand all that, but that is exactly the perspective that needs courageous conversations for our kids to improve. And you can't make up for that. And please remember, your standards do not say how kids access information or how they are to let you know that they know it. We're obsessed with reading and writing independently because of state tests. Our kids are not going to do well on state tests, regardless if they can't think and access content. So we as educators have put ourselves in a box by saying the standard means they have to read something independently and they have to be able to write responses. There is no standard that says that. That is us putting it on the kids. So we have to have courageous conversations about what do we do with our kids who can't access that fluently. We wouldn't do it with a blind kid. We wouldn't say to a blind person, look, I understand, it sucks to be blind. On the other hand, at some point you're going to have to see. And the person would just be like, what? But because a lot of our kids with disabilities don't look disabled. And these are beliefs and these are courageous conversations. So I would have that conversation first because it affects all of the other things here. Okay. I'm not going to go through the benefits of inclusion. But unless we have evidence-based practices for diverse learners in Tier 1, we're going to be putting kids in places where they are not going to improve beyond what you're doing. So inclusion, once again, is how the environment includes these kids. That perspective will help drive curricular changes in Tier 1. Threats to inclusion: it's simply a place, not a pedagogy. The lack of universal instruction, the lack of alignment between you in scope, sequence, and pacing and the class, and the lack of alignment of instructional materials. So if we want to do alignment, you can do pacing alignment. What we don't want to do with our kids with disabilities, we want to do 2 strategies that will help them in Tier 1. One of those strategies is to focus on pre-teach, review, and reteach. We should be pre-teaching in our time with them for what they are going to need to be able to do the next week or the next series of days. Now, we can't do that if we don't use the same materials in our work with our students as are being used in the general ed classroom. So you could be, if you're working on ELA stuff, you could be using the materials that they're using for ELA, or you could be using social studies book. Because that's heavy content. And it's focused on content. Social studies people, although we're still doing reading across the curriculum, they really are wanting kid to get the social studies concepts, right? So that's comprehension. Every 5th grade book of any kind has 1st grade words, 2nd grade words, 3rd grade words. You can find word lists and stuff to apply fluency to and those types of things. And remember, whenever we're doing fluency training, we must always, if in doubt, in the process of doing it, ask the kid, what is the meaning of that word? We do vocabulary and fluency together. We don't want kids reading, being able to sound out words and read them that they don't know what it means, particularly beyond 3rd grade. So we can lump fluency and vocabulary together, and we can use that medium for our IEP goals to pre-teach what's going to be happening. Pre-teach, I said this yesterday, think about yourself when you go into a setting and you don't know anything about it. You have a little anxiety over whether or not I can do this or what's going to be expected of me. And the minute that you discern that you don't have the skills to engage this conversation, you shut up, which is a good strategy. Why make a fool of yourself, right? Special ed kids feel the same way. But if they go into that class and a social studies discussion or a comprehension strategy is pre-taught to them, they then go in and as soon as it starts, they're like, I know about this. I got this. And if there's oral recitation, particularly in elementary, we will pre-teach sections of the book, and when it comes to oral recitation, the teacher picks that kid to read those 4 sentences, and the kid is prepared to do it. And that's working on our fluency and comprehension stuff. But it's also pre-teaching the kid for the material. So this last thing is critical. It's not just aligning the scope, sequence, and pacing. It's actually using common materials. And that sometimes causes some issues. But it will make all the difference in the world, particularly for the engagement that your student has. So those are the 4 checklist threats that if you're going to be including kids more, and those 4 things haven't been addressed, then the kid is not in an inclusive setting, but the kid is included because you put the butt in the seat. We call it the BIS strategy, by the way. Probably shouldn't say that on the recording, but. The other issue, just to, because I don't have it fitting anywhere, is students with disabilities have significantly higher rates, I don't know about yours, but I'm just saying overall, have significantly higher rates of chronic absenteeism than other students. And that chronic absenteeism has to be addressed because many times it's not legitimate. And chronic absenteeism is 10% or more of available days in school. So by the end of September, that's 2 days. You're chronically absent if you have 2 or more days, that's 10% of 20 days. But we often find that kids with disabilities, because of health issues, because of emotional issues and what have you, they often don't want to go to school, and parents have empathy for them. So it's not that the parents are enabling non-attendance, it's a complicated process. So take a look at how many days every month your kids with disabilities are absent, because instruction is not going to impact their growth if they are not present. We did a study in Florida looking at absenteeism rates by characteristics, EL, free and reduced lunch, students with disabilities, also by racial groups, by gender, and we collected a ton of research. We published chronic absenteeism surveys to be completed by students as well as to be completed by parents, and we learned a tremendous amount about why different demographics of kids don't come to school, and there are significant differences. For kids with disabilities, it was health related, but not necessarily something that should prevent a kid from coming to school. Okay, so just have a note for chronic absenteeism. Implementing universal instruction. So I'm going to start off with this and challenge you with something. If a general education teacher is utilizing instructional strategies for standards and learning goals that are evidence-based for kids with disabilities, that is specially designed instruction, and it can be put on the IEP. So you would have an ELA goal of improved comprehension, and you would have how many minutes a week that you're going to be working on that as a special ed teacher. If that kid is in an inclusive setting, you can add 450 minutes of that, 90 minutes a day for five days, and put it right on, because specially designed instruction is not a place and it's not who delivers it. It's if it's delivered with integrity and it's evidence-based for kids with disabilities. So that broadens, so now parents understand that the general ed teacher is a partner in this, because the general ed teacher is using SDI for all kids in the class. And that changes attitudes of parents about what a school is doing. It's not just, I need more time, my kid needs more time with the special ed teacher. No, probably not going to get any more time, number one. And number two, why should the special ed teacher make up for everything else in the 350 minutes a day? It's not possible. So this SDI in Tier 1 is a new frontier, both for IEPs as well as impact on kids. I don't know. I don't know what differentiated instruction is. I do know that teachers who have more than a few kids who need differentiated instruction, they're trying their best, but how do you differentiate for 8 or 9 kids in a class in a 60-minute math lesson? Come on. It sounds good, but when you parcel out how much instruction all these kids actually get and you're differentiating for a whole group, it's really, really tough. So think about this way. You as a special ed teacher have found strategies that work with your kids, right? Whether it's ELA or math. Yes or no? You have to say yes for your own mental health. Those strategies should become the strategies general ed teachers use when working with your special ed kid in Tier 1. Not something that they picked out of the blue because they went to a differentiation conference and that strategy was not evidence-based for kids with disabilities. So it's important that you communicate, whether it's comprehension, whether it's, you're teaching kids to chunk, whatever you're doing, let that specially designed strategy become what a teacher does in Tier 1 when they differentiate. Does that make sense to you? So just write them down and communicate it. I've found that this works. This works for kids with learning disabilities. So clearly this is a lot of collaboration, communication, but differentiated instruction in Tier 1 for kids with disabilities should be specially designed strategies, specially designed instruction that is evidence-based for these kids, and you're the ones that are most special ed teachers should know that. I went through this yesterday. I'm going to only spend a couple of minutes. All I'm doing is going through to show you the impact of specially designed instruction delivered in Tier 1 for reading and math, and the comparison of if that same instruction is used in small group or pull-out. So in this first one, this is reading comprehension strategy. It's called collaborative strategic reading. The top rate of growth is typical kids in class. The next rate of growth, which is the same slope, is kids with learning disabilities in that Tier 1 class. The bottom one, where it drops, is the rate of growth of kids with learning disabilities if that strategy is not used in a full Tier 1 setting. So whether it's small group or pull-out. And that theme will go through the others that I have to show you. This is the same strategy applied in high school, and it was applied in social studies classes, and the same outcome. This is enhanced anchored instruction, which is a strategy-based approach for math, and you'll see this was for kids with disabilities and without disabilities in both settings. Kids with disabilities in inclusive settings scored higher on math outcomes in the inclusive setting. This is another study on math, which basically said, in addition to kids with learning disabilities doing significantly better, more instructional time contributed to better outcomes. So imagine if you are working with this kid in math and you're using the same instructional strategies to pre-teach the kids as the teacher is using in Tier 1. That will move kids. If you're trying to do deficit, working on basic math facts or what have you, and that's not what's being worked in Tier 1, then this kid is like going to 2 different schools. I go to school for math facts, and then I go to school for this, and they don't communicate with each other. This is, if you wish to look this up, the strategic instruction model. This is at one of our schools in Florida. Over time, the blue line is all kids. The orange is kids with disabilities. The gray is overall learning gains, and the yellow is learning gains for kids in the bottom 25th percentile. The summary of that when this is done in Tier 1 is that special ed kids more than doubled their rate of progress over that time. And kids in the bottom 25th percentile, means struggling learners who didn't have disabilities, blew the top off of it. Their learning gains were just about the same as for all kids. Once again, done in Tier 1. Now, I want to be very clear to communicate to you that this is not in the absence of all the other supports. For those kids with disabilities, they still were getting services from special ed teachers. Many of them were getting services from Title as well. So this is just what, if this is done in general ed, how it enhances what you're already doing. It's not a replacement. It could never function as a replacement. But the bottom line is that time in inclusion has to benefit kids. It can't just be being with other kids. It has to benefit the growth rates for these kids. So these overall strategies, all of these methods that are evidence-based for typical kids, all these strategies were evidence-based for typical learners first, then applied to kids with disabilities, English learners with and without disabilities. They all come under the rubric of self-regulated strategy development. We want to teach kids steps that they can apply to any content area in order to be successful. So we don't have time to go over this, but I would like for you, there's some websites here where you can learn more about it, but here's the essence of it. Kids are taught, initially guided by teachers, a stepwise process that will enable them to be successful with the task. Teachers initially facilitate each step. Kids are in groups. There's a facilitator in the group. Kids are taught how to go through all their, say as we're now on step 3, they say what step 3 is. Initially the teacher does that, and then you transfer that to the facilitator. One kid is the scribe, and typically each group creates a product as a group product. All kids contribute to that product, but a kid who can't write isn't the scribe. And for ELA, the text is read out loud beyond 3rd grade to be sure that kids have access to content. So if you have kids with disabilities in that group, they don't have to read it. They have to have listening comprehension. So these 6 strategies represent what these other instructional models incorporate. So the bottom line is that if Tier 1 is using strategy approach to learning, whether it's ELA, science, math, social studies, kids learn strategies to be able to access the material. Now imagine what your role would be here. You're also using those strategies. So let's just take a reading comprehension. You know, how many of you are kindergarten teachers? Anybody? Okay, awesome. So the comprehension standard for kindergarten is when read a familiar story, we'll be able to identify key details or what have you. It's pretty close to verbatim, but the key here is read, because they can't read, familiar, controlling for background information, background knowledge, because having the content through reading, somebody reading it to them, and it's on something they already know, now they should be able to do the comprehension standard. Those words are in the 12th grade standard. So background knowledge about something is critical to kids being able to engage. So in that developed background knowledge, there are 5 steps. One of the steps is that the teacher says what the text is, what the purpose of it is, what the outcome is, and gives enough information, and then the kids have a discussion about what they know about that topic. Their personal experiences, their previous learning, and if some kids don't know anything about it, they learn from so now they have a place to land the comprehension. We talk about cold reading. How about cold comprehension? If you can read it fluently and nothing in that paragraph is anything you have background knowledge about. But if you have background knowledge, it'll activate the comprehension. Is that making sense? So that's what this is about. And you don't implement this overnight, by the way. If your school decided to do this, it would probably be a 3-year process where you began doing it slowly. So, but I want you to know about what it is about these strategies that enables kids with disabilities to engage them. So if you want to know more about that, you can look at this. I think that those, we've already talked about that. The third bullet is incredibly important. I don't know how you do stuff. Let me give you 2 quick examples. When I'm doing MTSS implementation with a district, how many of you have been through some kind of MTSS implementation? How many of you know what MTSS is? Okay. We put principals and a lead teacher through an abbreviated training, generally 1 or 2 days, before ever doing school teams. Because we want people already in that environment to have some capacity to do this and to serve as table coaches and what have you for their teams. As a building principal, I never wanted to go to some kind of professional learning with staff that I had no clue what this was about. Because the staff will look to lead teachers, to principals for leadership support, and it's much better if you have members of your own community who are familiar with this and know how to engage it. The same is true with doing strategy-based instruction. You would want to get some lead teachers trained on how to do it, provide support to them, and then they can serve as the coaches and technical assistants as you scale it up in your school. Yes?
What does MTSS stand for?
I'm sorry? Oh, MTSS, what is MTSS? It's multi-tiered system of supports. It's a framework for delivering all services to kids, we'll say at a building. What do all kids need? What do some kids need? And what do a few kids need? And strategically align resources with that level of need. It's not a pedagogy, it's not something new. What you do is you take all of the services you have in a building and put them into those tiers to see what you have. Where do you have gaps? And you find out that at tier 3 you have too many kids and one person doing tier 3. Well, that you gotta figure that out. So, and in some places you might have behavioral, social, emotional supports, and other places you don't. So it's just a way of we call resource mapping, and then looking at that and saying, do we need to put more emphasis here? Do we need to add stuff? What's the deal? Okay, integrated lesson planning, guided by the 3 principles of UDL. So first, integrated, we already said what that is, everybody planning together. By the way, we do this in our schools once a month. Everybody at that meeting, it's done on Google Docs in schools. So if a tier 1 teacher modifies the pacing, changes something, redoes assignments or readings or activities, the minute that how many of you work with Google Docs? Okay. The minute somebody changes something, everybody else gets alerted, and you don't have to have meetings. We have meetings once a month to get learning goals, scope, sequence, and pacing, and that process. We're going to go to it in detail in the session that focuses on that. But it's a method to integrate academic behavior instruction into a single system. You integrate learning goals, instructional strategies, and student engagement, and you identify problems that would interfere with kids being able to do the work. That's the rubric. There are 5 or 6 steps. Shocking. Most strategy-based instruction has 5 or 6 steps. And we're going to go over the protocols. What the quick answer to this is that imagine this table is a 3rd grade team. And somebody at this table raise their hand that they're a principal. Are you? Okay, I'm going to make you principal of this team. Are you a principal as well?
I'm an administrator.
Okay, so either one of you. And we have 3 general ed teachers, PLC for grade level team. We have a special education teacher. We have somebody who can allocate resources. It could be also support staff, school psychologist, speech therapist, whomever. And you guys talk. You identify the standards you're going to be focusing on, the learning goals, and those standards are going to be the same standards across time, but your learning goals are going to change as you move to more complex stuff. And you talk about what you're going to do. You, as a special ed person, are listening to that because you have 4 kids across their 3 classes. And you're listening to how they're going to present lessons, and you're going to listen to what they want kids to do in response to that, step 2 of UDL. And then you're going to cogitate about that and think, I think that'll work. Or, oh, Houston, we have a problem. And then you become part of the discussion because they now are going to do a process by which they imagine themselves in implementing this instruction and identify kids who are not going to engage it. Generally, that's 20% of the kids in a class. Now, you're there as a resource to help them in 2 ways. How can they adjust those instructional strategies for all kids to benefit special ed kids? And second, what can you do in your time with the kids to enable those kids to be more successful with those lessons? So you're coming away with knowing what they're doing, influencing what they're doing, and that influences what you're going to do. That's a short version of it. It's a little bit more involved in that, but that gives you an overview. And we do that once a month. And then you have all the learning goals and what the demands are, and you know what the materials are going to be used and all of those types of things. So now you can do your stuff in the context, but even more importantly, you can influence their thinking and decisions around instructional strategies. What we don't want to do, unless we absolutely have to, we don't want them to adjust something just for special ed kids. We always have to think as a special educator, would this benefit all kids? Because in general, any special education strategies will benefit all kids. But we don't want to add work to general education teachers. We want to actually have them doing less. Does that make sense? Okay. Thanks. Just by review, how many of you are familiar before right now with the 3 principles of UDL? Okay, awesome. So very quickly, this is so common sense, and it's so exciting because it's just easy to do. So as you're lesson planning, whether you're doing that as a group or by yourself, say, how am I going to present this instruction in different ways to engage different kinds of learners? So there could be visual, auditory, mixed, computer-assisted, peer-facilitated, and by the way, teacher-guided and peer-guided instruction have huge effect size on student outcomes, as opposed to teaching and then having the kids do tasks. That guidance has to be general, the teacher, and local with the kids. The second one is, okay, now that I've put it out there, how am I going to measure whether they are acquiring the knowledge, skills, or what have you? Some kids can write. That's an option. Other kids cannot. What are you going to do with them? So if you already have speech-to-text to access text, the reverse of that, those programs have text-to-speech. And a kid can simply respond to whatever the queries are. And then the teacher simply, how many of you have an iPhone where your voicemail also has a print version of it? Yeah. And how many of you read the print version and go, what? Who is that? Because it's not perfect. But remember, this is a comprehension goal. You're looking for content. You're not looking for punctuation and perfect words. You say, did the kid get this? Okay? And then the third is, how are we going to engage kids in this lesson? So those 3 things guide lesson planning. And if they do, then you don't have to worry about kids with disabilities not being included in instruction development. Because the first thing is different ways we're going to present it. Second thing is different ways we're going to let kids show us. How many of you use comprehension rubrics to score comprehension? You can have kids draw pictures, and you look for the elements in the picture that correspond to your rubric. You can actually grade comprehension through a visual product a kid develops that are part and use your rubric. So that's what UDL is. I'm going to skip this because in the interest of time. So Indiana, and if you go on the lesson planning session, you can download all this. Indiana has a lesson planning template, a statewide template. So if you're not happy with your lesson planning, download this template. And it starts with grade level Indiana academic standards, and it does things like learning targets, learning goals, relating to the learning to students, background knowledge, assessment criteria for success, outcomes, content area literacy standards or history, social, they clump them. But when you go to the second part of it, some interesting things are included. 8, what technology and media tools will be used in this lesson to deepen learning? For kids who can't read, you got all sorts of stuff that are deliverable through media and technology. Look at number 9. Ensure that all students have access to and are able to engage appropriately in this lesson. You're talking about your low-performing kids who may not have the skills to engage the lesson. So this is general education lesson planning guidelines for Indiana. This is not special ed. But the last 3 items are basically, if you apply the 3 principles of universal design to the expectation for those last 3 components, you will be able to do effective lesson planning. Differentiation and accommodation. Whoops. Look what it says here. It specifically mentions English learners, students with high ability, high-performing kids, and kids with disabilities. This is, in this guideline, a required, this is how you end. So I said before in our lesson planning, we do the planning, blah, 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 and then we say, now, who is this not going to work for? It's a conscious, explicit discussion. It also appears on your Indiana General Education lesson planning guidelines. And you can use the 3 principles to do that. So in particular, it says here, what evidence-based strategies, and this is so cool. When I saw this, Indiana is the only one who's got it. The problem with it is, as I work with school districts in Indiana, I find most of them don't even know this exists. They don't. But Indiana is such a leader here, but as often is the case, they have wonderful ideas and they don't get implemented. But look at the statement here at the end. What evidence-based strategies for differentiation for all students? That should send panic through your bones if you're going to take that literally. We have to differentiate for all. I've got 32 kids in my class. That's not what it means. It says select instruction that is evidence-based simultaneously for diverse learners, which is the examples that I gave you. That's what that means. Indiana is the only one that explicitly states it. So that last 3 items is going to require collaboration, communication. It's going to require courageous conversations about how to do this. And it's going to require an integrated lesson planning process. We already talked about all of this before. If you want to have access to online training around standards-aligned IEPs that lead to standards-aligned instruction, Indiana has a whole online training system for this. And you can access it at that URL. Just download the PowerPoint. I want to end by showing you some outcomes. These are 10 years, basically, 14 years of data comparing changes that we had in Florida with national trends across those 14 years. You will see this bottom line, this top line is all kids. Unfortunately, if you take a look at a lot of this, there's not been a lot of gains. People have been holding their own. The bottom line is the performance of kids with disabilities across those 14 years and nationally. And if you look at the difference between Florida and the nation, you can see the dramatic changes in the performance of kids with disabilities over time when there basically have not been any nationally. These 4 practices are what contributed to those. I have one more to show you and then let you go. These are graduation rates by subgroups over a 5-year period of time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1-year change and 5-year change. These are 4-year uniform graduation rates, meaning finished in 4 years and passed the assessments necessary to graduate. Okay? Let's take a look at a 5-year change. Look at the big numbers. All students grew by 9%. Black and African American students grew by 13.5% in that time. And that's also a issue around socioeconomic status, but it's huge. These are typical groups of kids I'm going to show you who struggle. And they improve graduation rate by more than 50% over all students. Take a look at students with disabilities, increased by almost 24% in the last 5 years. Almost 24%. That rate is huge. And look at kids who are economically disadvantaged, improved by almost 13%. So these 4 things benefit all the kids who are of interest to us. It takes time, but it is well worth the effort. So I hope there's something here that you engaged with that rattled you a little bit, that you will go back and have some courageous conversations about. And I really want to thank you for coming. Have an awesome weekend, and be careful driving.